Hi everybody, Ben Carpentier here. I feel like I need to start with an apology for the clickbaity title of my talk, Old Testament Slavery, the Good, the Bad and the Ugly. I can imagine some people seeing that and saying, slavery, good? There's nothing good about slavery. And they're right. The Old Testament law on slavery is one of the areas of the Bible most attacked by non-Christians because in today's world, slavery is pretty much universally an evil. And yet here in Leviticus, we find laws creating a structure for slavery and servitude among God's people. People ask, how can we worship a God who seems to approve of, or at the very least condone and institutionalize, an evil like slavery? Well, let me say this right from the beginning. I'm not going to be condoning slavery or defending it. I'm not going to try and explain slavery away or suggest that it served some necessary purpose in ancient times. I'm not going to make comparisons between biblical slavery laws and other slavery codes of the ancient world to show that biblical slavery is comparatively better than others. I don't need to do any of these things because my job as a preacher is to put forward what God says through the Bible. And God doesn't make any of those arguments. Instead, the Bible makes it clear that slavery is a tool of oppressors, and God stands against oppression. And yet it is true that when God is formulating the governance and laws for his redeemed people as they move into his promised land, as we've just read in our Bible reading, God includes laws about slavery. And they're not laws outright banning slavery, they are laws restricting slavery. And that is pretty confronting. It's easy to think that if God allows for something in his law, even in a restricted way, he is condoning it or even supporting it. But that is the exact argument that the Pharisees make to Jesus about divorce in Matthew chapter 19, verse 7, when they asked him, "Why then did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away?" They are asking, why did God put divorce into the law if he doesn't condone it? In verse 8, Jesus replied, "Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard." Jesus spends that whole conversation explaining that God's plan for marriage is that it should be for life, one flesh that should not be separated. But God knew that sin would wreck some marriages. He knew some people would seek to break their vows. And it's a terrible thing that hurts families and puts women especially in a very vulnerable position. But it's going to happen because people's hearts are hard. So God made laws to cover it, to ensure that even in this situation that goes against his will, there will be limits. And in the laws related to slavery, there is a similar logic at work. God's plan does not require anyone being a slave, but God knows that sin will wreck some people's livelihoods. The fact is, wherever there are desperate people capable of being oppressed, slavery lives and thrives. So God set down some hard limits, not just to protect people, but so that we would know that he stands against oppression. But none of that means there's anything good about slavery. So why is my talk entitled The Good, the Bad and the Ugly? Because the picture of God rescuing Israel out of slavery in Egypt is the defining picture of his relationship with his people in the Old Testament. It gets mentioned over and over again in the Old Testament law, twice just in our passage today. And the theme of slavery continues to play a huge role in our understanding of Jesus' work on the cross for our salvation and our relationship with God as Christians. Now, I'm not at all saying that God's actual rescue of Israel from slavery or his use of slavery as a metaphor for our relationship with him somehow redeems slavery or makes it any less awful than it is. In fact, slavery's awfulness is the point. There may not be anything more comparable than slavery to describe how oppressive sin is, how it traps us, how helpless we are, and how we need to be rescued from it. Not only that, but the language of master and slave helps to illustrate the relationship that we have with God. And we see that in Leviticus chapter 25, verse 43. Because the Israelites are my servants, whom I brought out of Egypt, they must not be sold as slaves. The English translation uses two different words. Because they are my servants, they must not be sold as slaves. But in the original Hebrew, it's the same word. God did not rescue the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt to set them free to do whatever they wanted. He redeemed them out of slavery so that they could now serve him only. And the picture goes even deeper still. Did you know that slaves could inherit the estate of their masters? In Leviticus 25:46 and elsewhere in the Old Testament law, we read about people volunteering to become slaves for life. And you might wonder, why would anyone voluntarily become a slave to another person for the rest of their lives? Well, one answer is that if you chose to become a slave for life, you stood in the line of that family's inheritance, especially if the head of the house had no children. You might recall Abram complained to God way back in Genesis 15, "You have given me no children, so a slave in my household will be my heir." This was one of the only ways that a foreigner could inherit a parcel of Israel's promised land. And this practice of adopting lifelong slaves into the family as heirs was also popular in the Roman culture of Jesus' time. The New Testament makes it clear that we are more than merely slaves of God. We've been adopted into the line of inheritance. Romans chapter 8 verse 15 says, "The Spirit you received does not make you slaves so that you again live in fear. Rather, the Spirit you received brought about your adoption to sonship." The word adoption to sonship means adoption of an adult as the heir. Our story as the people of God is one of redemption out of slavery to the oppression of sin and into the position of heirs of God. How does that adoption happen? By God himself humbly taking the place of a slave for us. Jesus told us in Mark chapter 10 verse 43, "Whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." As Jesus, God became a slave to each and every one of us. He served us. He gave up his life for us. And he did it voluntarily, as if any of us have the power to force God to do anything, much less to enslave him. So when God calls on us to be his faithful servants who he adopts as heirs, he's asking nothing more than what he has already done for us first. There may not be anything good about slavery, but the story that it tells about how God relates to us is definitely good news. So now let's move on to the bad. You may not think I need to explain to you why slavery is bad, but it is worth looking at what God has to say about slavery in the law, because it serves to further show us that God understands and does not condone the oppressive nature of slavery. We can start with the first verse of our reading, Leviticus 25 verse 39. "If any of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell themselves to you," let's just pause there. No one wants to become a slave. Anyone who says Old Testament slavery was voluntary makes it sound like you're putting your hand up for a church roster. Slavery is always a last resort. If slavery is one of your options, that's because your other options were poverty, starvation, death. Straight out of the gate, we're seeing it's desperation and poverty that lead to slavery, and God is acknowledging that. So, if any of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell themselves to you, do not make them work as slaves. They are to be treated as hired workers or temporary residents among you. The Old Testament laws make it very clear there is a delineation between hired workers and slaves. What were the key differences between a hired worker and a slave? There's two main differences. The first one is the kind of work slaves do. Slaves could be a lot of things in ancient times. Nursemaids, doctors, business managers. Joseph was basically the prime minister of Egypt as a slave. But there were some things that only slaves did. Chopping wood, carrying water, brick making, mining, working the oars on large ships. Those jobs were menial, back-breaking, and often dangerous. But God here understands how bad slavery can be. You see, he has already redeemed his people from back-breaking labour in Egypt. Allowing the Israelites to enslave each other in that way would go against his message of redemption. So he commands that when an Israelite sells themselves into slavery to a fellow Israelite, they must not be made to do such work. Instead, they must be given the work of a hired worker. This would most usually be farm work, which is still rigorous, hard work. But it's the work that any Israelite with a plot of land in the Promised Land was already doing. It's work with dignity. The second difference between a slave and a hired worker is referred to in Leviticus 25, starting at verse 44. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From among them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you as members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. Hired workers can come and go as they please. Slaves are another person's property. And I could talk about the different things that means from a legal perspective, but from a slave's perspective, it really only means one thing. Someone can control what you do using violence. Again, the Old Testament laws have a whole bunch of limits on the use of this violence. If someone beats a slave to death, they're a murderer. If they cause serious injury to a slave, the slave automatically gets their freedom. In fact, if you treat a slave so badly that they run away, the slave automatically cannot be returned back to that owner. But as a slave, you can still be beaten. Listen to this chilling rule from Exodus chapter 21. Anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a result. But they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property. As a slave, your physical well-being is in someone else's hands. If your whole family is enslaved, that means they can beat your spouse. They can beat your kids. That's what it means to be a slave. Being a slave is terrible. But again, God understands this miserable reality. And so he puts in this clause that the people he has freed from slavery shall not be ruled over so ruthlessly by their own people. Furthermore, the period of their servitude is limited. In other places in the law, it talks about a slave working for no more than 6 years and then being released on the Sabbath year. So every 7th year was a Sabbath year, where the fields weren't worked anyway. This kind of slavery is understood to be in repayment for smaller debts that could be worked off in a shorter time. But here in Leviticus 25, it talks about slaves working until the year of Jubilee. The Jubilee happened every 50th year. So after the 7th of 7 Sabbath years, and the Jubilee brings about a huge resetting of Israel's economy. In Australia, our economy is heavily reliant on the real estate and construction industries. Since 2010, house sales were 3 times more likely to be made to someone who already owned one or more houses than to a first home buyer. But in Israel, there were no land sales. Every family was assigned a parcel of land when they first moved into the promised land. But the thing is, fortunes change. Harvests are fickle. Maybe not everyone's a great farmer or a great manager. Sometimes people get into financial difficulty and they were forced to sell their land to someone else. But that is the land promised to them by God. How can you sell it? And so the answer is the year of Jubilee. Whenever an Israelite sold their land, the price took into account how many years were left until the next Jubilee, when they or their family would get the land back. Of course, if you sold all your land, how could you feed your family? The reason most people would sell their land is because some terrible debt had befallen them, in which case they would find their whole family in slavery. But for such a large amount, 6 years wasn't enough, and so they would become slaves up until the next Jubilee, when slaves were freed and land was returned to its rightful owners. Now those debts could be paid off earlier, and we read about that from verses 47 to the end of this chapter. Family members, or even the slaves themselves, could pay a redemption price before the Jubilee has come. But in the worst case scenario, you always knew that come the Sabbath year or come Jubilee, even if you hadn't saved a cent, even if no relatives came to your rescue, God ensured that your land and your freedom would be returned to you. Can you imagine everyone in Australia losing all their investment properties every 50 years to people who don't have houses? That's how revolutionary Jubilee is. Jubilee shows us that God's inheritance to us is eternal. It cannot be traded away for a bowl of soup when you are desperate. But it also shows us that God's provision is full of compassion. He doesn't want anyone to be trapped in the endless cycle of generational poverty, desperation, and oppression. So he designs a model of governance which doesn't allow wealth to become excessive and doesn't allow poverty to remain entrenched. I wish I could do a whole sermon just on the Jubilee, because it really is a revolutionary way of rethinking how society can value its people above and beyond the bottom line of profit at all costs, and especially at the cost of oppressing the poor and the desperate. Because now we get to the ugly reality of slavery. Slavery exists wherever the poor and desperate can be oppressed. And that means that slavery still exists today. In modern times, we've made slavery illegal, and so we think we don't have slaves anymore. But making things illegal never makes them go away. Slavery has just been driven underground. It's now in the hands of organised crime. Today we call it human trafficking. What that means is sometimes people are kidnapped off the street, but it's far more common that people are put into a cycle of ever-increasing debts that they can never repay. Or they're tricked into forced labour with the offer of an income to feed their family that never eventuates. Or they're lured into a remote area with a promise of work, only to find they don't get paid, and now they get beaten if they try to escape. There are young women and young men who flee abuse at home, only to find themselves seduced by pimps who use coercion and drugs to sell them into prostitution. Slavery might be illegal in every country on earth, but today it's bigger than ever. More people are thought to be in modern slavery today than at any other time in history. And it doesn't just exist somewhere else. every single person who is listening to this talk owns things that were made with the profits of slave labour. Cobalt is a key ingredient in the battery of phones, laptops, electric cars, and home storage batteries. The majority of cobalt is mined by slaves. Much of the charcoal that is used in forging steel is made by slaves. The bricks that are used to build the sweatshops that our cheap clothes are made, those are made by slaves. Imported seafood is 17 times more likely to have been caught by slave fishermen. One study estimates that up to 89% of women in prostitution have been trafficked. The list just goes on and on, but the truth is always the same. Anywhere poor, desperate people are able to be oppressed, slavery lives on. If you don't believe me, go to the website slaveryfootprint.org and take their survey. Find out how many slaves work for you. I guarantee you will be shocked. This problem is so big. What can we possibly do? Well, let me break it down to 3 simple things. Remember, rethink, renounce. It's easy to feel powerless. Human trafficking is a huge international problem, and the governments and law enforcement agencies of the world don't even fully understand it, let alone have the power to swiftly end it. What can one person do? What can one church do? We can remember. Remember that our God is the God who brought his people out of slavery in Egypt, a whole nation of people all at once. Our God is the God who detests oppression, who stands up for the cause of the poor and the desperate. We can remember the work of Christians before us, like William Wilberforce, who fought slavery once before and succeeded in making it illegal. We can remember those who are suffering in our prayers. I recommend joining the prayer network of International Justice Mission, IJM. They'll send you a weekly prayer update about the work that they do, helping free people who have been enslaved across the world. It's also easy to feel like nothing will ever change. Our society is built on supplying us with whatever we want, on companies racing to the bottom in terms of prices, on not asking questions about how anyone can afford to produce things so cheaply, on people having the freedom to make as much money as they can and to spend it any way they want. So much so that we now have billionaires racing each other to see who can fly into space first. But we can change how we think. We need to rethink how we see the world and make sure it aligns with God's principles of Jubilee. How does this plan or policy or practice reflect God's desire that everyone is given what they need to sustainably provide for their families? How does this plan or policy or practice reflect God's desire that the sources of wealth should not become excessively stored up with one person or one group of people? How might these plans, policies, or practices be threatening the welfare of the poor and the desperate? And how can that be changed to protect them? A really simple example of how our church is already doing this is our food pantry. It's just a small thing, but if it allows a family to keep food on their table and removes one element of financial stress, that contributes to reducing a feeling of desperation, which can so easily lead to someone being in a position where they will be oppressed. Even just being a member of a church community has been shown to reduce the likelihood of someone being a victim of human trafficking. It's easy to just keep on living the lives we live because that's what we were doing yesterday, and it's what everyone else is doing, and it's how our whole society is set up to run. But we actually can't do that. We are called by God to renounce, that is, to voluntarily give up those things in our lives and in our society that are contributing to the oppression of the poor and the desperate. And that's not going to be easy, and it's not going to happen overnight. We can't just give up electronic devices, especially when doing so would make us unable to work, unable to study, in the midst of COVID, unable to even connect with one another. But at the same time, when our remembering and our rethinking points out to us places in our own lives that are polluted by human trafficking, we must renounce them. And that usually means making more ethical purchasing choices, buying from those who can guarantee that their supply chains are free of human trafficking and oppression. That means buying less. And it means buying things that are more expensive, which is hard. But it actually means paying the real cost of the products we use, not an artificially low price that is reduced at the expense of someone else's freedom. That is a real, concrete way of ensuring that the poor and desperate have ways of sustainably providing for their families and reducing the risk of intergenerational poverty, preventing their families from ever being able to escape that desperate living situation. In all the history of humanity, slavery has not disappeared, nor will it, because there will always be poor and desperate people, and there will always be people willing to oppress them. But at least the Israelites knew that even if they had to sell their house and their land and even sell themselves, the year of Jubilee ensured that their slavery and poverty would come to an end. These are huge social-wide, nationwide, international problems. But the law of Jubilee in Leviticus 25 relied on each of God's people following his rules to make sure that in their homes, people were not being oppressed. So let's start with that. According to my slavery footprint, I have 13 modern-day slaves working for me. How many of those can I set free in 7 years by my next Sabbath year? How many can I set free in 50 years when it's my Jubilee? C.T. Studd, who played on the English cricket team in 1882 in the first ever Ashes match, was also a missionary to China, India, and Africa. And he put it like this: if Jesus Christ be God and died for me, then no sacrifice can be too great for me to make for him. These are sacrifices God calls us to make, not just today, but every day and throughout our lives. Jesus gave up everything to become a slave for us, so no sacrifice can be too great for us to make for him.